Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's panel discussion, Women in Resistance. This program is presented as part of Commonwealth, a program organized across 3 institutions, the ICA at VCU here in Richmond, Beta Local in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Philadelphia Contemporary. The project explores the historical concept of Commonwealth and its legacy in each of these 3 locations, asking whether it's possible to unleash the collective power of that term while also recognizing its connections to exploitation and colonialism. That leads to a set of questions. What do we share in common? Who is the we and we the people? How could we reimagine wealth and come together for common good? And how are our common resources used to influence wealth and well-being for our communities? Together, the curatorial team developed several components, including virtual programs like this one, and commissioned new work in response to these themes. You can see the results right now in an indoor exhibition or indoor-outdoor exhibition at the ICA, as well as a public project in Philadelphia. The work that inspired this program is one of these commissions. It was created by artist Alicia Diaz, who will be joined tonight by one of her collaborators, Patricia Herrera. All of you should have received a link to view the video. And if you haven't, please do take the time to do so. It's a really rich and powerful work. We also had the absolute joy of listening to the work of one of our other collaborators, Hector Coco Barres, whose music led us into the start of the program. Commonwealth includes a few other components. There's an online publication that will launch in mid-November, and 2 additional issues will follow that. Feminist theorist Silva Federici, a publication contributor, joins us tonight as well. We're also so pleased to be joined by Tariana Ferrer-Nunez of the Puerto Rican anti-colonial feminist activist group La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, and moderator Anai Lazarte of Beta Local. Today's program will run about 40 minutes, including time for audience questions at the end. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to type and share questions. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves and to the panelists. Also, the program is offered in English with simultaneous Spanish translation. So if you are interested in listening in Spanish, please use the interpretation button at the lower right to choose that channel. Otherwise, you can choose English. So that's it for the preamble. Thanks to all of you for being with us tonight, to all the members of the Commonwealth curatorial team for our ongoing collaboration, to all the staff at the ICA who are supporting tonight's program, to our translator, Myra, and most of all to tonight's panelists, who will now introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Anai Lazarte. I am the production coordinator for Beta Local, and I'm very happy to be here. So welcome, thank you for joining us. Although we can't see you, we do see a list of names of people who have joined us for tonight. So thank you so much for being here with us. And we'll just go ahead and start with the panelists introducing themselves. Alicia, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you for having me and us here today. Thank you to Stephanie and to the ICA for inviting me to be part of this exhibit. I am a Puerto Rican dance artist living now in Richmond, Virginia. I am dance faculty at the University of Richmond, and I am a dance artist. I want to begin before moving further, just really acknowledging and honoring that I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, some of whom I invoke in this work that I'm going to share with you, and those that I don't know as well, and on whose spirit of resistance and liberation I call on very often. So I want to acknowledge that as I enter this conversation today. And I also want to name all the collaborators of this work, because this was a highly collaborative endeavor. And Patricia Herrera will introduce herself in a minute. She's my anchor through so many of my projects, and so I will let Patricia speak in a few minutes and tell you what she has done for this project. But I want to call Christine Wyatt and Christina Leone Osayan, who were, as we've sometimes called them, creative doulas of this project. And so they were movement researchers, co-choreographers, costume arrangers, and they were creative and cultural organizers and facilitators of a way of working that was very important for this project, of which we will talk about later. And Luis Vasquez Larroche, who's an interdisciplinary artist. He was also a research assistant during this long research process that took place for this project, and set designer. So for those of you that have seen the film, all of the altars, all of the structures of the space were designed by Luis. And then we collaborated on the details of it. Héctor Coco Vares, that you heard some of his music earlier with Las Condiciones, is a musician, percussionist. He composed music that is recorded, and he also played live on the film. And that is an important aspect that we will also have a chance to talk about later. And what he brought to this project was really a foundation of Afro-Puerto Rican bomba, which is an embodied form of resistance, music and dance form. Yarani del Valle is an actor and vocalist in New York City who gives voice to the stories that we're bringing forward, and to the songs of protest that also anchor the work that we were doing. And David Riley, who was producer and editor of the film, and with whom I worked from the very, very beginning of the work until the very, very end, in all the many changes that took place, as we know, in any creative endeavor. So I wanted to bring everyone, since they're not here with us, but they're certainly here in the work that we are doing. I wanted to name them from the beginning, and we'll delve into more detail about their work later on.
Thank you, Alicia. Patricia, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Herrera, and I am one of the collaborators of Entre Puerto Rico and Richmond. I had my hands on many aspects of the project, but overall, I served as the conceptual and creative project collaborator, the dramaturg, and the script writer. I wanted to first also start off saying, since our conversation is about anchoring the work of women who have taken enormous strides toward awareness, understanding, and justice, I want to acknowledge the work that has been done by the organizers who are women and the panelists who happen to also be women, just to say, you know, to just acknowledge the work and just the fierceness of being here, but also doing the work that, you know, is sometimes invisible to us. But as a person who has been thinking about the practices of Nuyorican feminist performeras, I've learned so much about the connections between the feminist strategies of resistance and resilience here, and I'm gonna say here, Puerto Rico, and there, Richmond and New York City, and then also the feminist strategies then and now. So I'm part of our conversation is also thinking about geography and time. And so much of these strategies is, yes, a call for a more just future, but more importantly, and I think what we've learned in the process of doing this project is about carving spaces for a better now. And I'm so excited to be amongst all of you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Patricia. And Shariana.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Shariana Ferrer Núñez. I am a member and co-founder of La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción. So I just wanted to share some brief thoughts in the work that we do. Puerto Rico's colonial condition has been reproduced through technologies of repression and neo-colonial violence. Throughout our history, Puerto Rican feminists such as myself have been perceived by local and federal US government as being highly subversive and consequently subject to intense forms of repression. Feminists have been profiled and classified in profiles in our organizations as well, and even events and protests and actions infiltrated by undercover agents as a practice yet to be abolished here in Puerto Rico and of course in the US. La colectiva feminista en construcción emerges, means calls for new feminist agendas and new intersectional and transverse analyses of marginality and power. Longstanding Black queer feminist leaders that we have looked up on, like Anai Lazarte, las compañeras from the Combahee River Collective as well, decried the tendency to minimize intersectional feminist efforts through workshops and panels, and called for the development of political and economic proposals that would end the exclusion of women across different society institutions and activist spaces as well. So La Colectiva aims to disrupt the relegation of feminist issues to a second plane within socialist and communist organizations, and the delegation of the gender work to women within the Puerto Rican left. So that kind of makes a sense of where we come about. Similarity to this, La Colectiva members did not see much of the appeal of long-standing Puerto Rican feminist organizations that have failed to address class-based oppression, and as well as prioritize anti-racist work and police tactics on the streets, or haven't promoted a transition in leadership. Our work and our organization was founded in 2014. Initially, it emerged as a response to immediate needs to develop self-defense efforts, defend sexual and reproductive rights, avoid deportation, and anti-migrant violence. Various news outlets reported different assaults on women, so we kind of took that into, instead of kind of creating a rupture of the discourse as putting women as victims projected in news coverage, and the patriarchal prescription for women to avoid going alone at night at places as the solution. So we kind of created this movement to feel empowered, as well as addressing gender-based violence being reproduced in the institution and the state. So our work has been focused in mobilizing, movement building, but also aiming to a rupture in the neoliberal discourse of what feminism and what anti-racist activism is supposed to look like, but also by creating new narratives that are not only counter hegemonic, but also that builds in forms not only performing, but creating other ways of understanding collective and popular power, as well as resistance. So that's kind of the space that we intervene and create through activism, through political work, through political education and formation, space building, movement building, and resisting collectively. Thank you.
I wonder if perhaps Anai may be frozen, but I know that maybe Sylvia, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, my name is Silva Federici, and I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn. I describe myself as a feminist activist, a teacher, and a writer. I've been involved in the feminist movement for many years. I think now since the early 70s. And of course, you know, as she showed, the feminist movement is not one thing. There are many feminism. So the feminism I've always been involved in has been a feminism that has had a class perspective, anti-capitalist, of course, anti-racist. And I've also done a lot of writing and historical work, particularly looking at women's history in capitalism. And I think I'm here tonight because in my writing, I have stressed, and in my political work, I've stressed over and over the importance of transforming our everyday reproduction and politicizing our everyday reproduction, and the importance of historical imagination, of reclaiming our history, and how reclaiming, reconstructing our collective memory. It's an important part of our resistance. I work with a group of women. We have a website called Feminist Research on Violence. And of course, we mean violence in a very broad sense, not in terms only of domestic violence, but violence in the sense of institutional state violence. And well, with the assumption that in fact the system, the social system in which we live is a capitalist system that is, it's every aspect of it. You know, it's built on violence against people, and women and women of color and so on in particular. But, and therefore the need that we have to change it, to transform it. And this conversation tonight is part of it.
All right, thank you very much. It seems that in the introduction, we're kind of giving away what we're going to be talking for the rest of the time here, right? Maybe for the benefit of, if anybody in the audience didn't get a chance to watch the video in full, Patricia and Alicia, could you give us an overview of what the project is about and what are some of the important or main components of it?
Yeah, I'll begin, and then I think we'll team tag and go back and forth. And maybe what I'll do is to give a kind of broader context of how the project came to be in ways that were important for me and for us as we were envisioning what it would become. So when I had the invitation to be part of this exhibit, I came in really strongly having a sense of, for Puerto Rico, the concept of commonwealth is about colony, right? And so if I participate in this work, it has to be in denouncing that, right? Denouncing the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And as a Puerto Rican dance artist in the diaspora, to have a space to be able to speak, right? So a platform to speak with visibility is highly welcomed for me. I don't always have that opportunity, and so I really wanted to engage in that conversation. And so I had thought of the work in sort of three things that I wanted to do. I wanted to, yes, on the one hand, really clearly denounce the colonial relationship. I wanted to think of a lineage of resistance against that. And then I wanted to think of what we call danza combativa, right? Like combative dance that was very present historically in Puerto Rico, and then very present in summer of 2019, and all many protests that have been taking place where dancing itself is an important part of an embodied form of protest. And I think I'm really interested later, Shariana, because of that what I know you think about of performance and embodied work in different ways is of real interest to me. So I've been thinking a lot about that. The work then shifted in many ways, and it took a new form. And really the film that you will see became sort of the center of it, right? For the exhibit, for those that see it live at the gallery, there is also an image board that I created with Brian Castro, another interdisciplinary artist, in which I took images to do this part of the denouncing of the Commonwealth. And so there's that aspect of the work as well. And in the gallery, we also created altars that are an extension of the altars that you see in the film. So it's a very sort of multifaceted final work for the exhibit. But for what began the process of the film was really at the beginning a very autobiographical sort of desire to look into my own family lineage of resistance. And at the beginning, it was going to be an autobiographical work in that sense. And so some of that, I'm sure, will come out in the conversation. But one of the key figures of that is Manuel Rafael Suarez Diaz, who was my great uncle, who was killed in a protest, in a nationalist protest in 1932 at the Capitol building in Puerto Rico during a protest denouncing the co-opting of the Puerto Rican flag as a colonial symbol. And so I was interested in that history of my own family. My grandfather was Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia, who founded the Independence Party in Puerto Rico and who was a young lawyer of Pedro Albizu Campos, the well-known nationalist leader. And who came also to New York and Washington, D.C., where he worked with the Puerto Rican diaspora. So all of these family histories were of much interest to me. And what started as a project to look into that history, and that is ancestral work already, right, turned into a broader view, right? And so I began to move away from the personal stories and more looking into specific historical figures that I was getting very interested in. And especially then women, right? When I was thinking of my great uncle, I started thinking a great deal about his mother, Amparo, and what the role of women, right, in these movements of resistance. And that then led me into more research of specifically Dominga de la Cruz Becerril and Luisa Capettigo, who are the women that I ended up focusing on. And through those stories, I still saw this cycle of the personal and the political and the broader history. And so reading about Dominga, who becomes a nationalist leader, and we'll talk more in detail about her, mentions my great uncle as a moment, his killing as a moment of consciousness for her, and also her connection with Bomba in Mayagüez was also of interest to me, right? Of things that were coming back to me through the historical research. She is a really wonderful focus for us as bringing not only a Puerto Rican woman, but an Afro-Puerto Rican woman that is way lesser known than, say, someone like Luisa Capettigo. So what would it mean to bring to the forefront that story was something that was really important to us in this process. And there are many more things about her that we'll get to, and maybe Patricia will also speak to later. Luisa Capettigo, a feminist writer, anarchist, radical thinker, and really embodying her understanding of her activism, right, and her labor organizing was a fantastic way of entering also into this lineage of resistance that I was looking for. And what I found that was common between those two women was that they were both readers in tobacco factories. And that was an unusual role for women to have. So in the Caribbean, in New York, in Cuba, there is a tradition of tobacco readers who would read while workers were working, and those workers curated very carefully the readings that were taking place. And so they were classic literature, there were union readings, radical newspapers, labor organizing materials that would then be discussed by the workers and that would inform the strikes that would take place and the organizing that would take place. So here are two women in different moments, right? They don't coincide necessarily in their time, who were actively participating in this culture making, right, in the factories. That was really, really interesting to me. And then that led me, since I am in Richmond, Virginia, where I've been living for the last 9 years and spending time trying to understand where I am, right? Richmond as the former capital of the Confederacy and a central point of slavery in the United States. Tobacco is a very important here. So then specifically, I was looking at the American Tobacco Company as the link between Puerto Rico and Richmond, where I am. And maybe I'll leave it there and ask Patricia to take on as we entered into that aspect of this interweaving of the stories that we're working with.
Thank you, Alicia. So just thinking about the American Tobacco Company, they operated factories in Richmond, and just thinking about, one of the things that we imagine is thinking about what were the conditions like, who were there, how were people working, right? And so they were both Black and white women working in segregated facilities, right? At the same time that American Tobacco Company is opening its doors in Richmond, it has already opened its doors in Puerto Rico. So when the US occupies Puerto Rico in 1898, excuse me, the American Tobacco Company took over the industry of Puerto Rico, which meant that anything that was done by hand, all the artisanal shops were then pushed away. And these kind of factory productions took over. And I think this is where kind of the connection becomes for us, is really thinking about these interrelated histories. And the film itself was shot at the last standing site for the American Tobacco Company in the south side of Richmond. So literally as we were filming, they were demolishing around us. And the day after, the space that we were in, which were pillars, was gone, right? And so the idea of history being erased so easily because the physical space of the building was being demolished, that was so real to us in a moment where the pandemic had hit us, and there was beginning of protest. So for us, the idea of doing this project really put into perspectives this dual pandemic of systemic racism, right? And the COVID, and really brought to the heart of thinking about our creative process. It really grounded us in thinking about how do we reflect about what we're doing and why we're doing it, how to be, right? Because we actually didn't know how to be, how to actually like rehearse together, We were in lockdown, so it was the first time that we were coming together and trying to do this project. So the actual being together, we were trying to figure that out. And also the project grounded us in the necessity of how do we respond to the moment? How do we act in the moment, in being present in the midst of all this chaos, right? And so I think there's something to say about the women coming from different time periods, also different activist thoughts, right? So when we think about Dominga de la Cruz, she's an Afro-Puerto Rican radical nationalist. When we think about Luisa Capettigo, she's a white anarchist, right? They're coming from different school of thoughts. And so putting them together it's what Silvia is calling historical imagination, is asking us, what would it mean, right, for these two Puerto Rican women, right, one Black, one white, to be together? What does that look like? And for us as people in the creative process, women coming from different walks of life, different cultures, different racial backgrounds, Puerto Rican, Afro-American myself, Black, white, Italian, and different ages, because age also came into the picture of all this, to create this piece in the search of really trying to figure out, not integrating the Commonwealth, while also weaving the colonial relationship between the US and Puerto Rico, and also infusing that fraught history of Richmond as a formal capital of the Confederacy and one of the largest hubs for slave trading outside of New York City. And also one of the largest places to produce tobacco as well, like the hub for the production of tobacco. So that kind of interweaving for us really was important and was at the crux of the projects. Really, every time we came together, we questioned our positionality, questioned the positionality of the women, Luisa and Dominga. And that also helped to deepen the work that we did. I don't know if I missed anything else, Alicia, that we want to put in there.
No, I want to stress that last point that you said that goes towards the process of working that was intentionally really bringing these tensions to the forefront in today, in the group that we were working with. And that is the work that Christina and Christine co-facilitated of really bringing an anti-racist lens to the work that we were doing, and a way of gathering and thinking together and establishing values, making agreements. So both in terms of anti-racism and equity, and bringing up many questions as we were working that related both to the work that we're honoring, of the women that we were honoring, and also speaking exactly to today, right? To today in the broad sense of today, and today to the microcosm of our work, right? And all the many different questions that come up, and the messiness that comes up with that too, right? And the things that work and those that don't work, the limitations of the work as we're going through it, and what we learned from that for other projects in the future. And this is something we can also discuss further later, but I wanted to add that.
It's interesting how you're talking about weaving together multiple histories of resistance and these legacies of resistance, while at the same time having this awareness that the history of resistance is now, right? And we have a few very, ones that are at the forefront right now, anti-racism movement, the gender equality movement. And you can see it also in the description of what La Colectiva Feminista is doing, that's very much part of the work that they do. But then there's also the element of Puerto Rico's colonial history that doesn't really seem to be at the forefront of many other circles, but it's very real for us in our everyday lives. And it's also part of the work that La Colectiva Feminista is doing right now. So it's all very much connected. And I'm wondering how that work of sort of weaving histories together it's also part of how La Colectiva Feminista organizes its work. If we're thinking in terms of how this can inspire art, but also collective action, how do you see that connection, Shariana?
I guess one of the things that definitely, one of the principles that guides our work is self-determination and autonomy. And I guess those are concepts that we can apply in different scenarios of our lives, but definitely we need to think about self-determination and autonomy in terms of territory and the body itself as being our first and foremost first territory, but also the territory in relation to the land. And one of the things that I was so in awe of the piece is the ways in which the body and the body moves and creates movement as well. I guess that in terms of the story and the narrative and being built around Dominga de la Cruz and also Luisa Capettigo, thinking about how political education as a mean of political consciousness, right? And both of them as readers in workshops in these artisan factories before this type of work being industrialized was very important for organizing, right? So political education as a way and a form of gaining political consciousness, and through that consciousness we can actually mobilize and push for and struggle for better living conditions. So in a sense, and tracing that and putting it in dialogue with the work La Colectiva has been doing, we have our own feminist political school, right? In which we not only study, feminist movements, but also, participate in an open and very vivid discussion of what it means to build another life, right? And we have been doing different cycles. This is not an academic discussion, though it generates its movement generated theory, and we put it into practice. And most of the discussions that we're having have definitely shaped our actions, our performances, our mobilizing. And we see that, for example, it's been almost 2 years since we have been demanding for the government to declare a state of emergency regarding gender-based violence. However, in our discussions, we have been very open and very critical of what that state of emergency means, right? And it's taking, for example, the notion that as poor, racialized, working class, LGBTQ, feminized and racialized bodies, there is no, our current and foremost our history is a history of a state of emergency, right? We have always been subjected to the violence of capitalism, the violence generated by imperialism, and the ways in which both colonialism and coloniality are often reproduced towards Black, brown, poor, working families. So when Alicia was talking about that lineage of resistance, we were also discussing earlier yesterday, the ways in which those gaps, those silences, those the ways in which history and the archive itself has invisibilized the resistance of Black women and Black queer women especially. We need to reformulate and use what Sujia Hartman talks about, critical fabulation, in order to not just tell those stories as a form of plain storytelling, but in telling because we need to recognize, reaffirm, and also claim that history of resistance in order for us to actually transform the systems and dismantle the systems of oppression that are currently oppressing people, people in a very broader sense. So I guess that's part of the conversations that there were ongoing and creating with others, from others, and building that sense of collectiveness through body, territory, and mobilizing.
And it's obvious that part of the work of it has to do with the fact that so much of our history has been denied to us, right? And that research is essential, as you called it once, Alicia, that search for the origin story, but to make it make sense in what we're experiencing at the moment, that it doesn't necessarily have to make sense in the traditional historical linear way, but it has to make sense to us right now, and it has to be a resource, right? And I think, Silvia, you have worked on the idea of memory in the work of collective reproduction of meaning. I wonder if you could share some of that as a strategy for other collective movements across the world, or that you have researched.
Yeah, a number of things. First of all, in my own work for many years now, I've found that reconstructing history, and the history of the struggle, and the history of the oppression, and the history of the struggle is fundamental. I mean, that for a long time, it has been written that women have been absent from history, because this history has always been written from the point of view of men, and from the point of view of the winners, from the point of view of the oppressors. And so reconstructing the history, for me, has become in front of any political problem, political struggle, political issue. Always I take a step back. Always, the work I've done about Caliban and the witch and reconstructing the history of women in capitalism has been fundamental for making me understand, in fact, what is happening today. And I always return to it in a way, because I discovered that that history that seems to be past, it's actually constantly present in our life. It's still shaping our life. But on the question of resistance, history and resistance, this is very, very, very important. This was brought back to me with particular strength, visiting, women's organization, and particularly women organizing in around issues of reproduction in Latin America, Argentina and Mexico. In Mexico, and women told me, yeah, reclaiming our memory, it's a instrument of resistance. And they came to that in the course of struggle. They found that the communities, there's a tremendous struggle all across Latin America, all across the world, against extractivism, against mining, against dispossession, displacement. And women involved in this struggle, they found that those communities who had a much more an understanding of their history, of what had happened before them, of the struggle that had taken place, of the people who were buried in the land that they were defending. Those communities were actually much more able to win in the struggle, to have much more strength and much more resistance. And they understood why, because they realized that reconstructing their history, in a way, gave people the sense, make them understand that there was a common interest, make them understand that they were one subject, and make them understand also that what they were doing was part of something much, much larger than their life. In a way, they told me that it gave them a lot of courage. That, understanding where you come from, those who fought before you, that courage is not something that is biological. Courage, why people risk their life. People risk their life because they have an understanding of the importance of it. And that importance comes when you feel that what you're doing is not an isolated, singular act, but is really part of a whole history of liberation. So that you understand that anything that happens to you is not just you. Your life is not the end. You're part of a much broader body of people. And this enables you to be able to resist. So this whole question of memory and resistance is very, very important. And in this spirit, for example, I don't know if it's the time for me, if I have 2 minutes to talk about it, with women in Spain and hopefully also in other countries. We have begun a project of history, reconstructing history from below, and particularly in relation to the witch hunts that took place in the 16th, 17th century in many parts of Europe. And then they were brought to Latin America, to Abiyala, they were brought to Brazil, to Colombia, to Mexico. And we decided that so much of the history has been taken away from us. And so that we now have these study groups of women who go to the archive and take out the story. And who are these women? What was done to them? What it meant, what was done to them, what it meant for the women who came after that. And already, we had a meeting with a number of groups and women who had been doing this work, and it was really transformative. They said they're going to the archive of their town, and just seeing the story of these women, and knowing that in the streets where you walk, those women were burnt, those women were arrested, that to re-signify the places. It makes them look at the area, at the places, the streets where they walked in a very different way. And I think that this is very important, because I was, when Patricia was talking, and she mentioned that as you were, doing the film, everything was being demolished. Everything was being demolished. This is what is happening. The United States, I think, is the country that has perfected the science of destruction of memory. I think they have really understood the strategic importance of memory and history. History has been used to divide us, and anything that can be used, in fact, in the opposite direction. They erase the building, they destroy the names, so that we walk into desert, into areas, streets, town, villages. They seem to be social desert, but they are not. They are not. I'm always impressed when I travel in the United States and I see these Indian names. Sometimes they preserve the names, near on a side road and so on. And yet there was a whole history there. People lived, people fought, people loved, etc. But it's all been erased. So I think that this is part of the work I need to do. I think this is very much part of the struggle to keep. And also another factor, about the reconstructing the past is our solidarity with those who have died. Our solidarity, I think is very important. This is a theme that has come out so much in the struggle of Black Lives Matter, and now the movement in the last months. Those who have died have to be with us, the present. And our solidarity is not only with the living, but with the dead, because we cannot allow that their voices be muted. We cannot allow that the injustices that they have suffered, not be addressed. We have to be their eyes, their voices, and also their presence with us is what as I said before, gives a different meaning to our struggles.
Okay, thank you. I wish we had more time to go into this a little bit further, but I would like us to talk a bit more about the process of making this video, and in terms of the content of what we see and hear and feel, right, and sense, and then the process itself of doing this like a collaborative work with everybody who was involved. And this, as you've said, it's a piece that sort of collapses time and space, and there's a lot packed into it. So you could sit and watch it for 17 minutes and pick up on different things and tell this, okay, I remember, I know this, I know that. So, but I was wondering if we could refer to some of those objects or instances in the film that really talk about the very complex historical experiences of Puerto Rico that really bring that sort of intersectionality of race and gender and class also. And I don't know if I should just prompt you, because I know we talked about this. We were thinking about the object of the tobacco leaves, for instance, and the sound of a cacerolazo, something that's more familiar into our present. So would you like to talk a little bit about those objects or those elements on the film?
Yes. Maybe I'll start with the cacerolazo, because that came up yesterday also in our conversation with Shariana. So maybe Shariana, do you wanna share sort of how the impact that had on you, and then I'll take it from there.
Sure, why not? So we were talking about how, you know, la cacerola, or pot, was an object, or the object, the image of the summer in the 2019 summer protest here in Puerto Rico. And before it became to be the object and the image of that resistance of summer, La Colectiva, 2 years before, on 2017, we were discussing about, you know, and learning from other organizations, other movements, putting into historical and political context resistance in the Caribbean and in Latin America. So while studying and learning from these experiences, we stumbled upon on La Cacerola as a form, right, of protesting in Latin America, particularly during the 70s and the multiple dictatorships that were pushed through neoliberal and US imperial intervention in Latin American countries. So as that open historical and movement to movement conversation, we organized one of the protests against austerity measures in La Junta de Control Fiscal, that colonialism reformulated version since 2016 here in Puerto Rico. So La Cacerola was the object and the action, a means of protesting that feminist organizations and La Colectiva particularly used to put into narrative, right, and creating that discourse of hunger, of also an object of the domestic, right? Because you think of a pot and you think of it as a very feminized object, as a very a feminized labor, right? Cooking and home cooking, right? So we pushed for the La Cacerola in 2017, and that image was kind of printed or imprinted in the collective consciousness. And in the 2 years forward, in the protests that were pushing and claiming for Governor Ricardo Rosselló to resign from office, La cacerola also came, with a very more powerful and very loud form of creating noise, of disrupting. And that sound of the la cacerola, hitting the pot, became the cry of resistance, right? And I was very aware, once you hear it, you become very aware of that noise, right? Of what it communicates, of the vibration of la cacerola, and it becomes a calling, right? It becomes a calling so powerful that people, not only people in a very physical space protesting, use, and everyone brought their own pots and pans to make noise of it, but also in their own homes. So people kind of called in for a long distance cacerolazos, where everyone at a certain time at the day, it was particularly like at 8 o'clock at night, everyone would just start making that sound through wherever they were, right? So it was like a call that everyone stopped and stroke that cacerola to create a collective cry.
Mm. Yeah.
So when I was watching the video and the performance, even though you cannot actually see, and at any shot of the video, you can see a cacerola, you can hear it. And I was like, when we were able to talk yesterday, I was like, I'm sure that there's like a cacerola making, striking on the background. Is this correct? And we, had and engaged in this conversation of the use of an object, of an instrument, as a mean of disruption, right? As a mean of protest, as creating and shifting, right? Or reshifting and reshaping domestic to the public sphere, right? And claiming hunger as not because we are protesting austerity. So it's not just in terms of what feminized and poverty looks like, but also in a broader sense of hunger and impoverishment and precarity, and thinking through that lens, just disrupting with a pot that's supposed to be private and personal and strictly for home use. So la cacerola, as an image that we claimed or reclaimed by learning from the experience of Latin American movements in the 70s, and bringing that image to the Puerto Rican feminist movement in 2017, and then in a popular and collective resistance movement, a very broader sense of movement in 2 years after, in 2019, as part of the Ricky Renuncia movement.
Yeah, so that decision to use the cacerola was really intentional, and with all of that rich history that you're bringing forward. It was Héctor Cocobares who brought it forward to be used, and that we then, I love that space that you open up of what is heard but not seen, right? And that a lot of the work that we were doing with the film has all these layers of references that are here or there, right? That may or may not be understood depending on the position of the viewer. But that was one of the things that we were using to go across time and geography, right? Which is what is so important for us in the piece that you were talking about before, of collapsing time and collapsing geographies. And the cacerola then allowed us to do that, right? It's of the now and it's of the past as well. It connects us what you were talking about, hunger and impoverishment, directly with Dominga, whose children died of hunger, right, in Puerto Rico. And so there were all these layers. What you were talking about, the solidarity with the dead, Silvia, really spoke to me in these sort of, I'm calling them references, tools, things that we were wanting to bring forward to kind of help us navigate those different temporal, temporality. And the cacerola then became sort of the denouncing. So in every transition of the video calls back the cacerola, right? And then it leads us finally into the public sphere, which is what we call our last section in the more open space of the warehouse. So that was really wonderful to hear. And then also to play, though we didn't do it live, we didn't play the cacerolazo live in the space, but to hear that in the context of the warehouse of a Black space, right, where Black female tobacco workers were working, that in that space to hear that sound was also our way of interconnecting those histories, right, of bringing them together into the same space and time that is fictional in the sense of their impossibility of being together in reality, but we bring them together through means like that. So that's how I understand the cacerorazo.
About the tobacco leaves.
I was thinking about the ways in which everyone has really put at the forefront the body, right, as really the center of this kind of radical transformation that is occurring. Even if we think about the cacerolazo as who is hitting the cacerolazo, right, the body is the one doing it. And so much of the work that is being done, even with the La Colectiva, is how is the body an agent, right, to incite memory, to incite mobilization. So for like the images of women inscribed messages on their bodies, right, and then thinking about how the body in creating this film, we went through a whole sensorial journey of engaging with the tobacco itself, of the smell, how pungent the smell was, right? Feeling the tobacco, and reclaiming the tobacco as something that was used to oppress, or in terms of a capitalist function, to then transform it into the sacred object that was used to call upon ancestors, but also to remember that with the labor, you need also that radical rest in the midst of movement and mobilization. And so for us, and in the process, there's this kind of tactile sensorial engagement that goes with the object of the tobacco, which I also see very similar strategies that La Colectiva is using in bringing the body, right, at the forefront of how you mobilize people and engage people and inform people, educate people, right?
And in talking about historical imagination, critical fabulation, how we are re-signifying history or getting really involved into the reproduction of meaning. And it's interesting because we're really not separating the process of art making with the process of collective action in general. And if you've seen the work of La Colectiva Feminista, you know that a lot of what they do, a lot of what you do is very performative. You write chants. I mean, there's a lot of that aspect, right? But also, when you think about the creative process, it reminds you that there is tension in creativity as well, right? And just thinking of Dominga and Luisa together, as inspiring as it is, it's also, you know, wow, I wonder what would happen if they talked about race, if they talked about class, if they talk about gendered identities. I mean, what kind of conversation could we be hearing, right? And it's interesting, it's part of that sort of exploration. But it does bring to the front that the process itself is not harmonious always, right? And it's not always comfortable. And you mentioned before, Patricia and Lisa, that you wanted to be very intentional in making context part of the creative process as a group. Would you like to say more about how that was?
Want to take it, Alicia, or?
Yeah, I just unmuted. Yeah, so we were creating in the height of the anti-racist protests that were taking place, right, in Richmond, in the United States, in the world, and there was this necessity, right, of bringing these two things that we were doing together at the same time. There was no escaping that at night we were hearing the helicopters and the planes and the tear gas coming into some of our houses, that some of us were going to protests in the evening, that some were involved in the toppling down of monuments that were coming down in Richmond, and the whole movement against the Confederate monuments, and that of our collective, there were also activists and educators in different ways, right? So Christina works with food justice and with reproductive justice, and Christine is engaged in organizing around dance and equity, and so each of us is engaged in different ways of activism, and there is a range, right, in which we all contribute. And in that as well is the specific positions of where we are, right? And the tensions that come with different spaces of privilege that we all hold, right? So a lot of the conversations that we were having in these formats of working were about coming, articulating with each other, where are our places of privilege, for example, inside of our own group, right? What does it mean to do this kind of work that we're doing inside an institution, right? So we're working within the institution, be it of the ICA. I am faculty at the University of Richmond, as is Patricia as well. So what kind of privileges come with doing this work with the weight of the institution, in conversation with independent artists who don't have that same sort of back up? And what does it mean for us to collaborate and co-create together? Like how do those power dynamics begin to materialize themselves, right? And how do we engage between dance and film, say, and all the hierarchical embedded forms of working inside of film and a film crew, when you have women working creatively from a very activist, in the sense of embodying their politics in everything that they do, right? And so what happens when those two things collide inside of this project that we're doing, and what kind of conversations have to take place? How is it transformed? So what might the filming day look like if we don't follow the usual hierarchies of a film crew, right? What does that do? How do we think about equity in payment when historically dance artists have been at the bottom, say, of payment, right? And compensation for work within the arts. So what does that mean to bring that to the table? And what are the limitations? What are the limitations of doing this work within the institution? What are the limitations? I love, Sylvia, I've been enjoying so much your book of Beyond the Periphery of the Skin. And you're talking of the scars, right? That we come to the movement with scars. We come also to the movement with trauma that is we're all wounded by this capitalist system, right? So what are the limitations also of our own personal possibilities at any given moment, in any given context, inside of the work that we are doing? So all those things were part of the conversation. And most importantly, the question that they brought forward in their facilitation: how does our work, each one of us, in what we do, contribute to Black liberation, right? And so how that shifts the conversation and the intention of everything that is taking place.
I just want to say that we're nearing, yes, thank you, I'm sorry. I just want to say that we're nearing the end of the panel, and I know that this conversation will probably go on for a few more minutes, but I want to encourage our audience members to write in their questions so that we can take them in the next, maybe in the last 10 minutes of the panel. We already have one question, which might be just that kind, because my next question was going to be for Shariana in terms of how that's experiencing La Colectiva Feminista, but maybe we're just gonna read this question and I think you can sort of, do you think you can make that connection, or yes? You wanna take on that question? Yeah, okay. So we have a question and it says, with the push of the critique on the term feminism as it has been co-opted by white women in the US, what ways do you think you reclaim the term, and do you consider the term womanism in your work? The work itself seems to reclaim feminism for this body of people, even the stock reclaims the term.
So as Sylvia, okay, so should I go ahead and answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So as Sylvia mentioned earlier, we should talk about feminisms in a plural sense. I guess that for our work, La Colectiva, we take on Black feminism as a discourse, thought, written, theorized, and politically organized from the experiences of Black women at the center. And for us, the Combahee River Collective statement, for example, was like the text that kind of made us and guide us through our, founding conversations. So, of course, we think of womanism in terms of a form of disrupting and separating from feminism in a more white, liberal, capitalist sense of feminism, but we also reclaim our type of feminism as a Black feminist decolonial movement. And I think that even, for instance, Alice Walker, who coined the term womanist, I remember watching her 2 years ago at a conference, and she called herself a feminist in terms of also reclaiming, feminism as so we need to also, I guess that for us to understand the debates around concepts, it's important for us to situate also the political debates that are currently or have been going on around some of the concepts that we use. Like, for instance, another debate through concepts is the ways in which identity politics has also been co-opted and used and pushed for a neoliberal sense of identity that pushes individuality. And we can also do the same exercise with intersectionality. And, Kimberly Crenshaw has pointed out the many ways in which intersectionality has been co-opted and not used as the way, and she coined the term that takes, of course, in the notion of Black radical tradition and understanding how multiple systems of oppression, meaning white supremacy, meaning capitalism, meaning patriarchy, are interlocked. And you cannot see, for us to create a movement of liberation, of true liberation, means to center and dismantle systems of oppression as afar.
I think one of the things that for us to keep in mind is, like, while these Luisa Capettigo and Dominga de la Cruz weren't women who called themselves necessarily feminist per se, right? And so that is another, I mean, they were fighting for women's rights, right? But the idea of the feminism that we think today was not in their purview, right? So we're also aligning them, right, with a history and practice that they probably themselves as individuals would not necessarily say, yes, I am that, right? So that's something to just like clarify in themselves, because they're coming from different class, race, there's a big racial difference there, right? And so even the idea, as you had pointed, Anai, that they would actually talk to each other or connect with each other, the likelihood of that is probably really small, right? But I think what is interesting about thinking about creative process and the collective creative process is that because we were working, the core of us, the four core of us, like Alicia, Christine, Christina, and I, there was a sense of, oh, these women had children, and what came at what was the tension there was, oh, there were mothers in the middle of being activists, and that was a lot of sacrifice. Like, because they were mothers, they could never be good mothers because they were giving their time to the struggle, right? And so there was this big tension there that we were also trying to think about. This is about reproductive justice, that these women had to choose one or the other, that they couldn't be both, right? And for us, that was really important to really bring that into the conversation, thinking about what motherhood meant to them as activists and organizers, and how it wasn't necessarily embraced, right? It was not something that you completely separated your identity as a mother from your work as an activist.
I want to add, there was in a meeting I was in Buenos Aires, a woman said, you cannot be a good mother without being a 24 hours activist. Even to be a good mother, you have to make a struggle every moment of your life, because the devaluation, to me, feminism has been connected very much with the question of as a response to the systematic devaluation in this society of women's life and women's work and reproduction, the whole sphere of activities that reproduce our life, and it's been totally devalued. It's not even, it took a whole struggle to establish that this is work, because it was not even considered as work. And so I think that's really very crucial. To me, this is what, in a way, a feminist movement has brought to the struggle.
I have one more question. All right, so how difficult was it to reclaim the history that was depicted in the film and beyond being, and the tensions emerging from spaces of tension? What were the challenges of translating this history artistically? I'm guessing this is for Alicia and Patricia.
I couldn't see, I'm not sure what the question is, and I didn't fully hear. Can you say it again?
Yes.
Sorry.
I would say, what were the challenges of translating this history artistically? How difficult was it to reclaim a history that was depicted in the film and beyond being, and the tensions emerging from the spaces of tension? What were the challenges of translating this history artistically?
I think there's different layers here to the question. And so I'm thinking in terms of the research of the history, the histories themselves. We've talked a lot, Patricia and I, of, one of the differences between working with Dominga and with Luisa is that Luisa, as a white woman and also a prolific writer, there's a great deal of information about her and her own words, right? And mostly, you can read her, you can hear her directly. And Dominga, as an Afro-Puerto Rican woman, there is much less information to be found about her. And the one of the sources that we did find is an interview that also is her voice through someone else, right? So we're not hearing her directly, although to some extent also, yes, through the interview. So that was a big difference between those two. And then for the women at the American Tobacco Company, that is something in process. I think that we just got to knock on the door of that history as we were engaging in the making of the film. And so that is something that that we would delve into. I think if we were able to continue, we would delve into much more. But we're really interested when we began to find like really specific names, for example, of organizers, and a woman, Mama Harris, Louise Harris, in 1938, who led a strike. She was a tobacco worker, led a strike in Richmond, Virginia, that was successful in bringing the 8-hour day, Labor Day, and higher wages. And so when we began to find these very specific histories, that was really exciting. But so then that space that we had of knowing and not knowing, that's the question I think then follows of how do you embody that? What do you do with that in terms of dance as a medium, right? Dance and theater as a medium of the telling. And I think a lot of it was one, being really empapadas, ¿verdad? Like really going into the research itself a great deal, both Patricia and I, and then with Christine and Christina, like really talking. A lot of our rehearsals were more talking than they were actual doing. And I should say that what you see performance dance-wise are all structured improvisations. So our conversations about these histories shaped the choreographic structures in which then Christine and Christina improvised, right? And I think that that's really important to keep in mind in the sense of embodiment. And that one of the things that we brought forward in this collapsing of time wasn't only collapsing of time of Dominga and Luisa and women at the ATC, but also Christine and Christina themselves, right? So how do they speak through this history into themselves as well, right? And positioning themselves in that history, in the continuum of that history, in that space in particular, and as activists themselves, right? And so all of that really informed how the kinds of improvisations that they had, that they did. At the same time, there were very specific sort of, we call them scores, right, of movement. And we had, for those dance artists in the audience, perhaps will be interesting, but we had really six movements that we established at the very beginning, that had to do with actually looking at another figure, at Lolita Lebron, who is also a nationalist leader, and who led a 1954 occupation of the Congress of the United States with other activists, and shot in Congress. And I was looking at the newsreel of that event, and looked at specific images, not specific movements that Lolita Lebron had done during that newsreel, and sort of abstracted 6 movements of that. And some of it had to do with secret, or with strategizing, or with, I'm forgetting like all of them now, but there were 6 specific movements that came out of that exercise. And then they took those movements and applied them, and those words, and applied them to Dominga and to Luisa. And out of that came a whole vocabulary, both verbal and physical, that defined the kind of movement that was done throughout the entire evening, right? And so there are things like sewing, or there is the ancestral space is behind, there is to the heart, right? There is fierce, Like there's all these specific movements that they then organized in relationship to the overall histories. I don't know if that made sense, but there it is.
I think that just to give some context, Alicia, I think she was responding to a question from an audience member, which, and I'm going to add in something because I think it's relevant. How is the movement and the movement of dance changed the shape of protest and the shape of feminism, and I would say also the anti-racism movement? How can we best theorize this movement towards movement and the movement of dance? Is that what you were, Alicia, were you responding to that question? Or is it sort of a nice coincidence?
I think it was a nice coincidence.
Okay.
And that question, I would delve perhaps at another time into this idea of danza combativa.
Right.
That is very important right now.
I wonder if we could address that to close the panel, because we're already at 7:30. So I would love to open it up. I don't want anybody to feel that their time is up, but if you have any final thoughts on the movement of dance as part of the movement of protest.
I would expand it to dance, yes, but also thinking about how do we use the arts in general as a vehicle to mobilize, to incite, to educate, right, and to inspire in many ways. I think what's interesting that Alicia just talked us through is that the tension is necessary and productive. Like that if there was no tension, that we would not do anything really, but that the tension really incites us and moves us and demands us to ask questions. And so the moment that we're in is full of tensions and contradictions. But what came through is that we understood together as a collective the context. And then there was a moment where it was, okay, let the body express, let the body drive that understanding. And then what is created with that, right, was this new vocabulary that you saw, right? So I think the possibilities of creating new ways of being and understanding is the power of the arts, of dance, of theater, of singing, of music.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that and kind of leave for the future that, or when people are watching the film as well, that bomba is at the Afro-Puerto Rican bomba is at the bed, say, of the music that is in this film, and that bomba is a very important not manifestation, expression right now of protest that is of a lineage of resistance that dates back to slavery, right? And that inside of bomba, there is an enormous amount of reclaiming and reimagining what the role of bomba can be, and for women, for the queer community, for bomba as Black expression and protest is in a really exciting moment of being activated, and so I think that when you're working with these forms of resistance, always understanding their history and where they come from and the integrity of that as the fuel, as the engine of how they're being used in these protests. And I am really inspired by what I see both in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora with a form, for example, like bomba, when it is tied to what they call, bomba practitioners call and defend as fundamento, right? And from fundamento, you can innovate and you can speak in many different ways, but always maintaining that understanding of where it comes from, right? And it comes from oppression and an affirmation of life and liberation.
If I can just add something very brief to that. So I have to point out something that Silvia was mentioning earlier in terms of history being the one told by the conquerors and putting everyone else as failure. So, taking that premise and linking it to what Puerto Rican dancer and performance artist Luisa Capettigo calls the choreography of error, and thinking about error and thinking about failure, and what La Colectiva, Feminista en Construcción have resignified what it means to assuming risk and becoming a threat, right? We have been taking very close to heart and as part of our narrative to assume politics without guarantee in Stuart Hall's notion of embracing the risk of doing political work, of creating movement and putting ourselves, and most of the time when we're talking about putting ourselves in the forefront and in the center, is in a very frontal, defiant mode of being and pushing. And especially in these pandemic times where the body becomes a threat to others, and proximity to that body also means higher risk, we have been able to resignify and kind of use that premise as empowering to the way in which we need to push for proximity in terms of thinking of ourselves in a more ourselves in terms of what Sujia Hartman talks about, vulnerable to premature death, and that as being part of the afterlife of slavery, and how capitalism resignifies and reformulates itself in order to suppress and oppress us. So I was thinking about, Viveka Vázquez's work in terms of error and failure. And as we've been, in the case of La Colectiva, we've been articulating putting death as a point of departure and thinking about death in terms of not as the destiny or as white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism pushes us to that premature death, but as claiming and reclaiming death as a point of departure. Because when you're already defeated, or at least being defiant of death, then you power and the possibility of life and another types and other forms of life can only come through. So yeah, we've been kind of thinking about the body and centering body as the only our only arms, are coming into arms with the body, and putting that body for the movement, through movement, and bodies in movement, in order for us to build that other forms of life that we definitely been talking since our coming of being in 2014.
Silvia, something you want to add to help us
I wrote
conclude the topic?
I wrote a piece called "In Place of the Dancing Body," and there's no time now, but basically the body has a history. It connects the theme of the body and the theme of history, because I think our bodies record and express, our defeats, our victories, the jobs that we have had. There's a whole, you can read bodies. Bodies are not, biological entities, but they are historical products. And I think dance, what really inspired me, the piece that I wrote was inspired by seeing a dance, by seeing that there was so much liberating power in the movement that people were making. It was like a struggle against the chains that people have interiorized, that shape our movement, shape how we walk, how we move, And seeing the dance was really a struggle for liberation. And I think that's what's been expressed by everybody, you know, and it's very powerful.
Right. Well, thank you. There's always so much left to be said, right? There's so much, so many conversations we had over the phone to help us prepare for this. We wish we had more time. But I want to thank you all for being here with us. And I want to thank our guests and our audience members for joining us for this panel. And I hope you're well. Just stay connected to find out about more events related to the Commonwealth exhibition. And again, thank you, Silvia, Chariana, Patricia, and Alicia. Abrazos. And thank you to the production team as well.
Thank you.
Abrazos. Thank you.
There you go. Bye-bye.